The story of GTA 5 is considered shallow for most people because when folks are playing, they end up getting lost in the middle of the action and some sarcastic things that end up happening in the midst of the story, right? In the midst of all that hidden lore and so on. After playing over 3,000 hours of GTA 5, man, that's a lot of time, right? I decided to bring a complete video for you about the entire story of the game, as you probably have never seen, where it will basically present the characters and story connections that were very poorly explained, connecting with the main development of the story, which many people don't quite get when they play. And with that, I will show all the hidden narrative that is happening and that influences each character at every moment of the game until it leads to the end. That being said, I won't even ask for your like or subscription now, because I know that as you progress further in the video, you will do that automatically. Got it? So no more delays, let's get started. It is very important to make it clear that the explanation at the beginning of this video may seem a bit boring, but as things start to connect, right? All the stories and the plots start to emerge in your mind, you will realize that the GTA 5 story is simply amazing and that you didn't appreciate it. So let's start here with the prologue, which is where it all begins. In 2004, inside the game, let's go. The game starts in the city of Ludendorff, North Yankton in the year 2004, specifically in the middle of a robbery at a security agency that looks more like a bank. During this heist or pulling off this robbery, we can see three people. We have Michael DeSanta, who is one of the protagonists of GTA 5, Trevor, who is also one of the protagonists of GTA 5, and here we have a third man, a blonde guy known as Brad. Remember this name? This trio, Michael, Trevor, and Brad, at this point are well-known criminals and are already wanted by agencies like the FIB, the state police, etc. Nevertheless, they manage to pull off various heists perfectly and always escape during these actions. So then, in this heist they take the hostages and manage to pull off a robbery of around $175,000. As they leave the bank, they are met with a police response that they believe to be abnormal. Michael even comments on this to Trevor, like, there shouldn't be this many people. And Trevor says it's normal. After an intense shootout, the three of them finally make it to the getaway car. But even in the getaway car, the police are hot on their trail. The police manage to fatally shoot one of the people in the car, who is not part of those three from the beginning. It's a fourth character known as the Hillbilly, who was a hired driver just for this job. He is not part of the trio. After this driver takes a shot to the head, Michael needs to take the wheel of the vehicle and crashes into the police car, which makes it so that there are no more police chasing them. They don't have anyone on their tail anymore. With that, Michael goes to the meeting point where a helicopter is waiting for them to be able to escape. When they are almost reaching the location where this helicopter would be, Michael ends up colliding with the passing train, right? Because they want to pass before the train and crash the vehicle really badly into a pole that is there. With this crash, Trevor decides to escape through the snow, through the side. Trevor gives this recommendation to try to reach the meeting point they wanted, which is after the village where they were. Going around the village, Michael suggests that they continue following the exact plan they had agreed on at the beginning, which was to pass through that village even if it meant going on foot. With that said, Michael, Trevor, and Brad start walking towards the village, when a special agent from the FIB named Dave Norton manages to shoot Brad a shot right in the chest. As Brad falls to the ground, Trevor runs away and Michael is desperate, looking around trying to figure out what happened. At that moment, Michael also gets shot. Trevor, in an attempt to save Michael and Brad, who were great partners of his, starts an intense shootout against the police, and after many shots, more reinforcements start arriving. And with that, Trevor finds himself forced to flee into the mist, leaving his partners behind. Shortly after this shootout, we can see a funeral for Michael, who is the second guy who got shot, with his family crying in front of the grave, a priest conducting the ceremony, etc. But in this funeral, there's a very strange thing. That same special agent, Dave Norton, who had shot Brad and then shot Michael, was also there. And after seeing this special agent, we can see in the background Michael with glasses and a hat simply there, making it clear that he is a guy who is hidden outside the grave, calm. In other words, he wasn't being buried. In fact, he stayed alive and faked his own death. After this scene, the game jumps straight to 2013, which is 9 years later, where Michael, who is the guy who faked his own death, is talking to his therapist about his current life. He complains bitterly about his children, Jimmy and Tracy, stating that they are just bums, who don't contribute to society or help him in any way. Michael also at this moment is also complaining about his wife, who constantly ends up cheating on him, among other things, maybe even worse. After this huge outburst and cursing everyone out and telling a bit of his story, saying that he used to be a pimp, among other other things he did to take advantage of every opportunity he had in life, he leaves the therapist, sits on the beach bench to relax, where he ends up meeting the second protagonist of the game, actually the third, right? Because I already introduced Michael and Trevor. The third one here would be Franklin Clinton. Franklin is coming with a partner of his named Lamar, who asks Michael about a certain house he needs to go to, like, do you know this house? And then he ends up giving that information. After that information, basically speaking, we start playing for the first time with Franklin, where we have to steal 2 vehicles at the house he asked about and take them to a dealership for Franklin's boss, a guy named Simeon Yatarian. Upon arriving at the dealership, we see Simeon negotiating with Jimmy over a yellow SUV, and the Jimmy I'm talking about is exactly the same Jimmy, Michael's son. Jimmy up to that point has not been introduced in the game, but he is Michael's son, and who is the same guy who faked his death back in 2004 and who was just venting his frustrations to the therapist. So it's all kind of connected here. Well, continuing here about Franklin. After delivering the cars, Franklin returns to his house where he talks briefly with Lamar, and after a few days, he is contacted again by Simeon, his boss, to do another vehicle recovery job that wasn't paid for properly. This time, the vehicle is a green motorcycle that was sold to a member of the gang, the Vagos gang, and it is very important to make it clear that at this point in the story, Franklin Clinton and Lamar Davis, who are partners, are members of the family's gang or the families. This gang is a rival gang of the Balas and also a rival gang of the Vagos. This information is a bit important for some things we will talk about later. There are some other rivalries as well, but the biggest one is between the Balas, Vagos, and the families, which is the gang that Franklin and Lamar are part of. And because it was a motorcycle that was sold to a Vagos member, the territory where they would have to retrieve this motorcycle also belonged to the Vagos. Franklin goes then very apprehensive for this vehicle recovery. Upon arriving at the Vagos territory, they do not find the motorcycle, but some members of this gang appear and decide to argue with him, where an absurd shootout begins. After Lamar shoots one of the gang members. After that, Lamar and Franklin kill several Vagos members, manage to escape unscathed, and also manage to find and recover the motorcycle, killing the owner of the motorcycle in question. With everything that ends up happening, Lamar and Franklin decide not to deliver the motorcycle to Simeon and tell him that they simply couldn't find the motorcycle, and that's what they do. Lamar leaves with the motorcycle, while Franklin ends up giving the sad news to Simeon that they couldn't find it. So far, Simeon doesn't suspect anything. A few days later, Simeon asks Franklin for a new job, which is to recover exactly the same yellow SUV that was being sold to Jimmy during Franklin's first mission. The one where Franklin arrives and Jimmy is there buying the vehicle that Simeon is offering, and now Franklin has to steal that SUV at Jimmy's house, which is also the home of Michael. However, there is a small complication here, right? This vehicle is not on the street like the first one we stole, so we have to enter Michael's house to be able to steal it and open the garage gate from the inside so that he can escape without further complications. Franklin then takes a walk around the house and manages to find a way in and sees that everything is a complete mess inside Michael's house. While he's sneaking around, Jimmy is playing video games in his room, toxically cursing people online. Tracy is chatting with a friend on the phone, and Amanda, who is Michael's wife, is flirting with the tennis coach in the kitchen. With all of this going on, Franklin has no trouble going unnoticed through the house and indeed manages to steal the car easily. The big problem is that after driving for a few minutes with the vehicle, Michael gets up from the back seat and points a gun at Franklin's head, demanding an explanation for what's going on. And here comes a very interesting point, because there are many people at this point who believe that Michael was already inside the car because he knew Franklin was going there to steal the car. However, it's very hard to believe that, right? Because Michael would hardly know the intentions of a thief inside his house. Like, this guy could be a thief trying to kidnap his son or something. It wouldn't make sense for Michael to be hiding inside the car. Therefore, the biggest theory in the entire GTA community is that Michael was hidden there in the back seat because he already suspected his wife's betrayal with the tennis coach. So he was hidden inside the car, waiting for something hotter to happen between the two of them so that he could then intervene and teach a lesson to his wife, the tennis coach, and so on. Going back to the main subject, Michael has a gun pointed at Franklin's head and demands an explanation of what's going on. Franklin comes clean and tells him that his boss, Simeon, asked him to take that vehicle as a repossession because the payments were not up to date. Michael immediately realizes that it's all a financing scam where cars are sold at exorbitant interest rates, and even without any delay, they are supposedly repossessed due to non-payment, so they can be sold again, generating a huge profit for the dealership owner. Franklin says he's not involved in any of that that the only job he does is repossessing vehicles. So Michael tells Franklin to drive to the dealership so that he could deal with his boss directly. Upon arriving at the location, Michael orders Franklin to drive straight through the glass, causing considerable damage to the dealership. And as he gets out of the vehicle, Michael gives Franklin some dollars and gets into a fistfight with Simeon, where he beats the guy up and says that if anyone enters his house again or anything like that happens, he will come back and Simeon won't like that return. However, there is something interesting that happens during the conversation where Michael is threatening Franklin. On the way to the dealership, Michael told him that they could one day grab a beer and that he would explain how the world really works. The big problem here is that Franklin ends up believing that this is true when Michael was just being polite or sarcastic. Well, having said that, after a few days, Franklin goes to Michael's house to talk to him about that beer and so on. And that's when Michael ends up telling him that it wasn't serious, but since he was already there, they could grab a beer and hang out. As they are leaving, Jimmy, Michael's son, ends up calling him and whispering on the phone. He informs that he is in danger, that he tried to sell his father's yacht to make some money as he was in need of cash. However, the buyers, the supposed buyers, actually didn't want to buy anything, they wanted to steal the yacht. And in this case, Jimmy was inside the yacht, which could easily end up getting killed and so on. With that in mind, now Michael needs to save his son and save the yacht, since he was a bit short on money and wouldn't have the money now to buy another one. Since Franklin was already there, supposedly to have a beer, he asked for Franklin's help, who promptly helped him on the way to the location where the truck would be passing with the yacht on top of it. They are talking during this journey and Michael tells Franklin that he can still teach him some things, but he is retired from the criminal life. He no longer pulls off heists, he doesn't do robberies anymore nowadays. Still, Franklin decides to keep helping him to see if there's anything he could really learn. After an intense chase and a crazy shootout in the middle of the highway, they manage to save Jimmy, but they can't recover the yacht, which ends up being taken by the other criminals. After that, Michael recognizes some of Franklin's worth, but still doesn't have any job to pass on to him. And with that, Michael goes back to his normal routine, while Franklin also goes back to his routine, which is the world of gangs, etc., along with Lamar. When Franklin comes back to talk to Lamar, Lamar says he had an idea to kidnap an OG who is like a big shot within the gang, basically a top dog or almost top dog of a certain gang. This guy they're going to kidnap is known as D. His nickname is just the letter D. The idea is that with this kidnapping they could get $40,000. So they go to the last known location and after an intense van chase, because D flees on a motorcycle very quickly and you go in the van after him. After a while the guy ends up crashing into a bus and at that moment Franklin opens the van and lets Lamar's dog, known as Chop, out to chase after this dude D and sniff him out. Since they are kind of at a train station, stop, and the guy is hiding behind an inside train cars. After a while, they manage to find D with the help of Chop and then definitively put him inside the van. The big problem here is that this D knew Lamar, so he knows exactly who is kidnapping him at the moment he is getting into the van. Even so, Lamar denies it, saying it's not him as he's trying to cover his face there and so on. Along the way, Lamar calls the other guys to ask for the ransom, and at that moment Franklin gets extremely nervous with him, grabs Lamar's phone from his hand and throws it away because he knew it could be tracked by that device. After that, he simply releases D, who had just been chased and kidnapped, because he had no use for them since they wouldn't actually get that money. The right thing would have been for Lamar to have taken and made the call from an anonymous or public phone to be able to keep that kidnapping going. After a few days of this event, now going back to Michael's life, Michael arrives home in the middle of the afternoon and no one answers inside the house. He calls out for his wife, the kids, etc. When he goes out to smoke a cigarette, he notices 2 tennis rackets there, both his wife's and her tennis instructors. With this, Michael now is sure that something is going on. He rushes upstairs and sees Amanda only in a towel outside, telling him not to enter the room. When he enters the room, despite her telling him not to enter, he sees the tennis instructor only in underwear, which proves that Amanda was cheating on him with the tennis instructor inside his house. Michael threatens the guy immediately, who flees through the balcony, and when Michael goes down to catch him down there, Michael ends up coming across Franklin, who had gone there to visit him. And since Michael was already going to chase the tennis instructor to settle his unfinished business with him, he calls Franklin again to go with him and help. After a chase through the city, it is possible to find the tennis instructor in a huge and wonderful house in Vinewood Hills Canyon. Michael then, after a brief argument with the tennis instructor, ends up knocking down that balcony as a way to vent all his anger at what the instructor had done to him and his wife. But the big problem here, which is only discovered after Michael knocks down that balcony, is that that house was not the tennis instructor's. A tennis instructor, as he says, would not be able to afford a house like that, and in fact, that house belonged to a very dangerous Mexican drug lord named Martin Madrazo. And as soon as Michael gets home, after dealing with some henchmen who tried to get him on the way, Martin Madrazo shows up with his team and beats Michael with a baseball bat. After that, he tells Michael that he will have to pay for the house repairs as well as the a hotel for his mistress, etc., and it will be around $2 to $2.5 million. The problem is that at this point, Michael is broke. He didn't have as much money as he used to when he was pulling off heists, and he had just lost his yacht, which could have been a sale that would have raised a lot of money for him. With that, the only alternative left for Michael now is to go back to the criminal life, go back to pulling off heists and robberies, and for that, he contacts an old friend of his who was a great planner of this type of heist. This man's name is Lester. Lester is a guy with a certain age, I don't know, between 40 and 50 years old. He has a physical problem, right? He has a disease that affects his body movement and such, but even so, he is a very brilliant guy behind the planning of heists, etc. He doesn't just pull off heists with Michael. He does this in various locations, with various people and various teams. He is always the mastermind behind the operation. So, when Michael calls Lester, he ends up having a big surprise as he discovers that Lester already knew that Michael had faked his death and had been alive all this time, living in Los Santos. Lester then gives him his address and Michael goes to his house to talk. Upon arriving at Lester's house, Lester ends up revealing that he knows a lot about Michael and asks in the end if Michael really returned to action because he knows that Michael was basically retired. When Michael says yes, he says that he will need a favor so that they can help each other. The favor Lester asks of Michael is for Michael to sabotage a prototype cell phone from a company called Life Invader, which is a representation of Facebook in real life. After sabotaging this prototype during a live presentation of that cell phone, the owner of Life Invader dies with his head exploding live. So the favor was done for Lester. Lester used to ask for these favors to influence big companies so that he could pull off stock market scams. For example, with the death of that guy, the stocks would drop, he could buy those stocks and wait for them to appreciate before selling them and making a lot of profit from this operation. With the favor done, now they could move on to what Michael needed, which was some kind of robbery. When they discuss this robbery, Lester gives some ideas like the Union Depository, and Michael ends up dismissing this Union Depository heist because he considers that idea to be almost suicidal. It would be something very big, like robbing the National Reserve, and what he was looking for was just a way to pay off that Mexican. Thus, Lester suggests two other heists, a bank in the countryside in Paleto Bay and a jewelry store in Los Santos that seemed very promising. Due to the ease of access, Michael ends up opting for the jewelry store as it is nearby and probably won't have many guards. 28, so they set out to do this reconnaissance and see if it's really worth it. Michael dresses up as a very rich guy to go to the jewelry store and disguise himself inside, wearing glasses and a transmitter that takes photos and can even listen to audio. When they assess inside the jewelry store, they come to the conclusion that there is approximately $5 million in jewelry, which would be enough for Lester to make some money, for Michael to pay the Mexican dealer, and still have some money left over for Michael, who was also low on cash at that moment. So Michael immediately tells Lester that he would like to put Franklin on the team as well, because Franklin has been helping him out with some things that have been happening, and that if Franklin is not a professional yet, basically by his side, Franklin would become professional. Lester ends up agreeing even though he doesn't like the idea very much, as long as Michael takes responsibility for Franklin. When they go for the heist, they manage to act extremely coordinated, doing everything in a very balanced way, where they knock out all the customers with sleep gas, invade the jewelry store during the day, break everything in the middle, and take approximately $5 million in jewels. They escape on motorcycles in an extremely coordinated way. But here is an essential detail in this heist that changes the course of Michael's life and everyone else's here, which is a phrase he says when he is leaving the jewelry store. At the moment he is about to leave, there is a guard talking to Franklin about moving those bikes from there. Up to that point, that guard had not realized what was happening inside the jewelry store. At that moment then, Michael leaves the jewelry store, grabs that guy from behind, throws him to the ground and says the following phrase: "You forget thousands of things every day. Make sure you forget this one too." And what's the problem with all this, right? This phrase was also said back in 2004 in the North Yankton heist.
You forget 1,000 things every day, pal. Make sure this is one of them.
This is because Michael saw this phrase in a movie and he basically uses it as his trademark. So there is a moment when Michael is cornered in the prologue during the North Yankton heist and Trevor needs to decide whether to kill the guard or not. Before he kills the guard, Michael says exactly the same phrase: "You forget thousands of things every day, forget this one too." In other words, this phrase is a trademark from when he was an active thief. And at the exact moment Michael says this phrase in 2013 outside the jewelry store, there are no consequences, as until then that guard didn't know Michael's story and everything is fine.
You forget 1,000 things every day. How about you make sure this is one of them?
After that, they managed to escape through the tunnels of Los Santos, and after some police resistance at the end of the tunnel, they managed to evade the police, store the bikes inside a truck that was already well organized, and finally stash all the money, feeling relaxed and waiting for a few days for Lester to be able to launder the money. Once everything goes smoothly, Michael is able to pay off the Mexican drug dealer known as Martin Madrazo, and Franklin goes to Michael's house to celebrate, since in a way they all ended up making a lot of profit from all of this. When they arrive there, Franklin and Michael are celebrating when a third person shows up, and this third person is the special agent from the FIB, Dave Norton, the same guy who had shot in the game's prologue in 2004 at Michael, and also shot Brad. And here you can see that something is getting a little stranger because something doesn't quite fit. Dave Norton at that moment starts talking about the style of the heist, about the coordination, and that if people read Michael's record, they will immediately realize that it was him who pulled off this heist, even 9 years after his supposed death. This is because of the coordination and agility with which they entered and exited, etc. Michael, at that moment, denies any involvement with that robbery, etc. And then at this point, Dave immediately questions Michael about Trevor and what he would do if Trevor found out about it. And then Michael suggests that Trevor, who was his partner back in North Yankton, is already dead, or at least should be.
You forget thousands of things every day. You'll make sure this is one of them. That was pretty scary.
After that, the scene cuts to Trevor, who is now alive and well, making love to someone else's girlfriend at that exact moment and watching the news when he sees that same guard who was outside the jewelry store talking about his terrifying experience with the thief who uttered that classic Michael Townley line, "You forget thousands of things every day, make sure forgetting this is one of them." With that, Trevor almost immediately has a flashback. He remembers that it is a trademark of Michael, his former partner, and he even goes out to think for a moment, kind of tripping, trying to understand everything that's happening and how it would be possible for Michael to be alive 9 years later if he saw Michael die in front of him in North Yankton years ago, or if there was another person pretending to be Michael. So he had to clear that up somehow. And as he left the trailer to think, as I said before, he was hooking up with someone else's girlfriend. The woman he was with stayed inside. She was the girlfriend of a guy named Johnny Klebitz, who is the protagonist of one of the GTA 4 DLCs. The woman's name was Ashley Butler, who also appears in GTA 4, and after an argument between Trevor and Johnny, Trevor ends up cold-bloodedly killing Johnny. After all this madness, he decides that somehow he has to go after Michael, right? He has to know who is pretending to be his friend, or maybe it's Michael who is there. However, before going, Trevor has to settle all his things where he lives. So far, he lives in the desert, in the interior of the state of San Andreas. Let's say here that he runs a company selling magical substances, and in order for him to leave there peacefully, he has to take care of all his rivals, and that's what he does. He first attacks the Lost MC at their camp, and then goes on to attack the leader of another gang known as the Aztecas. The leader's name is Ortega. Trevor throws Ortega's trailer into the river and then kills him. After doing these two things, he sends one of his henchmen, known as Wade, to Los Santos to look for his old friend, known as Michael Townley. While Wade goes out to Los Santos to find Michael, Trevor continues to settle his affairs before leaving. Upon arriving at a bar, Trevor encounters a Chinese dealer representing the Chinese triad, who are looking for suppliers of magical substances. Trevor then proposes a deal with them and takes them to his lab to show that they produce a lot there, all top-notch quality, so that they could close a deal with this Chinese mafia. Upon arrival, Trevor ends up face to face with the Aztecas gang, whose leader was previously killed by Trevor. So these guys decide to attack Trevor immediately as a way of retaliating for their deceased leader, etc. At this point, Trevor takes Tao Ching and his translator, who are the two people representing the Chinese in this deal, and puts them inside an ice cream business, which I don't know the name of, right? It's like ice cream and ice there, and leaves the two hidden there so they wouldn't be hit in the shootout with the Aztecas while Trevor gets rid of the whole gang, so that later on, they could come out of the ice machine and continue the negotiation. However, after Trevor finishes the shootout, he goes there and frees the two, and they basically don't want to talk anymore, just say they'll come back to talk and so on. By that point, they disappear. At this stage of the game, Trevor thinks everything is fine, that they'll close the deal and all. Trevor goes back to the trailer where he used to live and sees another gang retaliation, but this time it's not from the Aztecas, which he just dealt with. This time it's a retaliation from the Lost MC, the biker gang. They went to Trevor's trailer and ransacked everything while he wasn't there. The only person there at that moment was another guy who also works for Trevor, known as Ron, and these guys destroyed everything trying to find Trevor but couldn't. Trevor then decides to plan with Ron to take over a runway that belongs to these bikers, the Lost. They sneak in at night and start killing several gang members. By the end of dawn, they have taken over the entire runway, killing numerous members. After taking over this territory as their own, this airstrip then, etc., Trevor goes back to that same bar to negotiate with the Chinese, with Tao Cheng and his interpreter, where he is faced with the sad news that the Chinese will not close the deal with him. They have already closed this deal with other manufacturers of magic substances, who are the O'Neill brothers. Trevor gets extremely furious and attacks Tao Cheng, who is the son of Mr. Wei Cheng, leader of the Chinese mafia, leader of the Triad, etc. And after that, he goes in search of the O'Neill brothers because in Trevor's mind, the O'Neill brothers stole this deal from him. Trevor then goes to their territory and kills many of them, leaving only those who are not there alive. There are several brothers. It is a large family producing magic substances. After committing all this massacre and blowing up the guy's lab so they couldn't produce anymore, and the Chinese had no choice but to come back to Trevor. Trevor goes back home as if nothing had happened. Arriving there, he now encounters Wade, but in the middle of all this mess, one thing that is very important to make clear is that he is always talking to someone on the phone, and that person is Brad. Brad is the blonde guy who got shot at the beginning of the game back in 2004, and according to the messages he exchanges with Brad, Brad is locked up in a maximum security prison, and he told Brad about Michael, and Brad doesn't seem to believe it much, believes it's someone pretending to be him. Still, Trevor decides to go after Michael, and now with Wade there in his trailer, he manages to find out what Wade discovered. Wade informs Trevor that he didn't find any Michael Townley, but he found a person who matches the description of Michael, who is actually named Michael DeSanta. This Michael DeSanta has 2 children, a woman named Amanda, and the age also matches the description, etc. So basically it could only be him. Trevor then decides to move to Los Santos, to the house of Wade's cousin, named Floyd. But before arriving in Los Santos, he still needs to stop by the Lost MC camp and destroy everything to make sure the Lost wouldn't seek revenge again. Basically, he destroys the camp to further weaken the gang, and once done, heads to Los Santos. After a good amount of driving, Trevor arrives at Floyd's apartment, where he will be staying and doing some other jobs in the meantime. While Trevor is getting organized and settled in Los Santos, we now go back to Franklin's story to see what is happening in the world of gangs. Now, we come across an acquaintance of Lamar's who was in prison and is known as Stretch. This Stretch was in prison and now he's out, and it seems like he's one of the leaders, or at least a very influential person within the family's gang, of which Lamar and Franklin are part, and now Lamar has a new deal to make, as if the failed kidnapping of Dee wasn't enough. In this new deal, Stretch goes along with Lamar and Franklin. After that, they go to the location, and upon arriving there, to Franklin's surprise, the person there to make the deal is actually the man who had been kidnapped by Lamar and Franklin in the other mission. After a little conversation, Stretch and this Dee realize that Stretch had nothing to do with it. The conversation quickly takes a different turn and he starts explaining some things. Things start to get a little weird and everyone begins to realize that Dee had set up with the Ballas to get rid of Franklin and Lamar for the failed kidnapping they attempted. So here you can quickly see that Lamar is not very smart. He makes some negotiations that make no sense at all. In the face of this, Stretch, who was with them, ends up feeling obligated at that moment to kill Dee because for him it was a matter of betrayal and life or death, and they start an intense shootout against the Ballas, which in the end, the police still come after them and they have to flee quickly so they are not caught. Stretch then, inside the car after the escape, makes it clear that he will try to resolve that beef with the Ballas so that it does not come back to him in the form of gang revenge, and that it may happen that one of them, either Lamar or Franklin, has to die or be handed over to the Ballas because of this, as a way to leave all that beef in peace and not escalate into a bigger gang beef. After that happens, in Franklin's life, Trevor finally decides to go to Michael's house to find out if it was really him and so on. When he gets there, Michael is arguing with Jimmy for storing a package of relaxing substances in the fridge and also arguing with Amanda, who now doesn't have tennis lessons anymore, now has yoga lessons. Out of nowhere, Trevor manages to show up in the middle of the house, leaving everyone in shock. At that moment, even Jimmy is a little scared. Amanda is completely terrified as she was already afraid of Trevor, and even the yoga instructor who was there beside her gets scared, even though he had never seen Trevor before. He is clearly in shock. Michael, knowing that Trevor wanted some kind of explanation, stays there in that tense atmosphere. He tells Trevor that he entered a witness protection program and that he is still there today. Trevor then knows that something is wrong. He talks there and all, but since he doesn't know exactly what it is, he ends up letting it go and trying to get more information from Michael over time. With that, he ends up asking where Tracy is, who is Michael's daughter. At that moment, Jimmy says that Tracy is going to embarrass herself on national television on the Fame or Shame show, dancing to see if she can gain some kind of fame. Trevor then tells Michael that they need to immediately go and save Tracy from this national embarrassment. And in that, they are talking inside the vehicle, trying to understand what each one went through after all that period there in 2004, even though Trevor is extremely suspicious of everything Michael is saying because he already knows that Michael is a liar and manipulator.
Somebody say yoga?
Trevor?
Michael.
Hey, it's good to see you, man.
Yeah, I bet it is.
Upon arriving at the location, Trevor decides to go with him. They see the host hitting on Michael's daughter. They start chasing and threatening the host, who is known as Laszlo. And after managing to corner him, he finally does a dance, like dancing in his underwear and all, and says that she will have to return to the show. Michael's daughter will have to go back to the show, but this time the guy will have to make sure she does it right just because he harassed her. And then, after all this mess, Trevor simply decides to go his own way, doing some other things while Michael returns home, kind of horrified by the whole situation he had just experienced. Michael then contacts Agent Dave Norton, who is the FIB agent he met at his house. They arrange to meet at the Los Santos Observatory. At this meeting, Michael explains to Dave that Trevor is actually alive, as he had suggested, and that Trevor is already in Los Santos, which is a big problem for Michael. Dave also explains to Michael that now he is also in big trouble, and this new problem for Dave is his new boss named Steve Haynes, one of the most despicable guys in this whole story. This boss of Dave Norton, Steve Haynes, has read Michael's file and he knows what Dave and Michael did back in 2004, right? A shady deal. And now this same boss of Dave Norton, Steve Haynes, wants to use Michael for various jobs. Actually, he doesn't say they're various jobs. He says he'll need help, a favor, etc. But Michael basically already knows that this means doing shady jobs for the FIB, so he won't be turned in or captured. 48. As Michael and Dave Norton are kind of out of options because if either of them falls, Michael's deal with Dave is done. They decide in a way to help each other. With that, Michael will help Dave with his work, and this favor that Dave now needs from Michael is basically to enter a morgue and look for a man named Ferdinand Karimov. This guy supposedly would be linked to a terrorist cell within the United States, and the FIB at this exact moment in the game is in a budget dispute with another US government agency called the IAA. This other agency is in a feud with them to show more service. In other words, basically FIB and IAA, whoever shows more work, more service, more success would get a budget increase. This was extremely important at that moment in the game because according to radio news, the government was implementing budget cuts, which could result in mass layoffs or even shut down some departments. So this new budget would be essential to keep everything running the way it was before. That said, Michael then agrees to do the job. Dave knocks Michael on the head so that Michael faints and enters the morgue as if dead. Inside the morgue, he starts looking for this Ferdinand guy. When he gets there, he sees that there is actually no man dead there, and that this man's tag is on a woman's body that doesn't match the description of the guy, which suggests that the other government agency, the IAA, has already captured this guy and is probably interrogating him somewhere while he is supposedly dead to the government. Michael then needs to escape from the morgue as he is discovered. After fleeing the morgue and all the mess, he will personally meet Dave Norton's boss, Steve Haynes. Arriving at the meeting, he meets Steve Haynes and another person named Andreas Sanchez, who is basically an assistant to Stephen Haynes. There, Michael discovers that he will actually end up doing various jobs in a way for the FIB, because he is in the hands of this guy and doesn't have much of a choice. Aware of this, they now have a new mission that Steve Haynes is assigning, which is to locate and capture this Ferdinand guy from the IAA headquarters, directly from the building. For this, Dave Norton ends up contacting Franklin Clinton because he already knows that he now has a partnership with Michael. And even against Michael's will, he contacts Trevor Phillips because he believes that this would be the best strategy, to keep Trevor close by. Dave Norton believes that if Trevor were to find out about the whole agreement that had not been revealed until then, Trevor would be furious and could end up killing Michael. However, if they could keep Trevor close, they could tell their version of the story and thus build the narrative that Michael was forced to fake his death and not that in fact he betrayed his partners and faked the whole heist in 2004, etc. Because as we can see in a conversation that Dave has with Michael, we can find out that the whole Ludendorff heist in 2004 was set up to go wrong so that Dave Norton in that heist could capture Trevor and Brad while Michael would escape. However, as we saw, right, Trevor manages to escape, and that was the loose end that came back to haunt Michael 9 years later. That's why they are going through all this scheme to keep Trevor close. Then, as the preparations for the heist unfold, Michael quickly introduces Franklin to Trevor and they all meet there and head towards the central building of the IAA next to the FIB building, where they rappel down from a helicopter, break in through the window and grab the guy who was being interrogated at that moment, taking a beating, and then flee by helicopter in a cinematic scene, causing chaos all around. Basically, they managed to take this guy to a hideout not far from there, where he will be tortured again. But this time, instead of being tortured by the IAA, he will be tortured by FIB personnel to extract information about a supposed terrorist who is allegedly in the United States. Steve Haynes, after a while, calls Trevor and Michael, Trevor to torture the guy, while Michael goes with Dave Norton to find the location where the supposed terrorist would be. Going to the locations, by car, Dave and Michael talk in the city, and after a few hours of torturing the guy and some locations, according to the information given by the guy being tortured, they come to the conclusion that a man named Tahir Javan, who is at a party in a beach house, is the terrorist they were looking for. So they assassinate this guy, and after assassinating this guy, basically, the FIB leaves Michael alone for a short period of time. Meanwhile, Franklin returns to his gang world, where Lamar now has a new idea for something that this time will definitely work. The idea now is the following: selling magical substances. Lamar then is now with a bag full of money that he will take to Grove Street to a guy who will deliver the substance to him. But then when Lamar gets there to call Franklin in front of his house, Trevor shows up there, and now that Franklin and Trevor already know each other, Trevor ends up meeting Lamar too. And so this job that Lamar was going to do with magical substances, Trevor ends up inviting himself, and they go together to Grove Street, which was once the family's area and is now the Ballas Gang's area. When Lamar hands over the money to the guy, which is a very suspicious business, the guy hands over the block of magic substances to Lamar, where Lamar has to take a taste, to see if that stuff is good. But Trevor, man, he's already a big dealer of this kind of substance. He's done all kinds of deals possible. So at that moment, Trevor suspects that something is wrong there. Like the negotiation is too easy. That's where Trevor asks to taste the other side of the block, and the dealer refuses. Trevor kind of invades the negotiation, pulls the block from the guy's hand, and realizes that that block in fact was fake and they were being deceived. They were paying for 1 kilo, and what they were receiving there was practically a gram. It was really to deceive. In other words, all that was somehow set up, and all that negotiation was organized by a person you've already seen here, Stretch. However, Stretch did not count at that moment on Trevor's intelligence and cunning. In other words, most likely that job Lamar was going to do would be his and Franklin's death sentence, as they would be paying for 1 kilo of drugs, and when Lamar went to deliver it to the gang members who provided the money for him, he would deliver the plaster package. And at that moment, everyone would accuse Lamar of stealing from the gang, which would lead to Lamar and Franklin being caught by the gang and killed. But as I said, thanks to Trevor's intelligence, they managed to discover that the package was fake, resulting in a big shootout in the middle of Grove Stretch, where they managed to escape after killing several Ballas members and fleeing through the Los Santos sewers on jet skis. And after evading the police on jet skis as well, with great difficulty, Franklin already suspects that Stretch was behind the whole failed negotiation. But still, he lets it go, and everyone separates to hide from the police for a while. Meanwhile, Michael is at his house living a completely different situation. He arrives home and starts arguing with his wife, who is getting ready for a yoga class, and the yoga instructor suggests that the answer to Michael's problems is, for example, for him to do yoga. And he actually decides to do a yoga session. He goes through it completely, but at the end of the session, he clearly realizes that his wife is now getting involved with the yoga instructor instead of the tennis coach, which becomes very clear when the guy flirts with her in front of Michael himself, and Michael gets really angry and goes after the yoga instructor, who is much younger and more agile than him. Just to make it clear, Michael here is between 45 and 48 years old and is a sedentary guy. So this yoga instructor quickly manages to dodge Michael, tripping him and watching him fall into the pool. Amanda gets extremely furious at that moment with Michael, which makes no sense at all, since she's cheating on the guy practically in front of him. And that's when Michael decides to take his son Jimmy and go out, right, to do something different. Jimmy then actually decides to go buy some substances with Michael, and he takes and gives a little to Michael without his father knowing what it is, right? He says it's just a little something that everyone uses. However, with that, Michael gets completely high, completely anesthetized, and Jimmy did this intentionally. After that, when Jimmy sees that Michael is completely out of it, he kicks Michael out of the car, goes home, and tells his mother that his father freaked out, used drugs while driving, etc. And at that moment, Michael's family kind of falls apart. And after all the hallucinations that Michael has because of the stuff he took, he comes home and finds a very sad note from Amanda, where Amanda says that this time Michael crossed the line and that she couldn't continue living with him because it made no sense to her. He was too dangerous. He was unstable. So for her safety and the safety of her children, she practically emptied the bank account, took the car, and left him only with the house and the weapons, thankfully. And faced with this whole scenario, Michael takes some time to think about life. Meanwhile, Trevor, who is causing chaos in Los Santos, is heading back to Floyd's apartment, who is Wade's cousin. And then he asks Floyd about his job, to understand what Floyd does, and Floyd ends up revealing that he works at the port of Los Santos. This sparks an idea in Trevor's head for a possible mega heist. Trevor then pressures Floyd in a threatening way to take him to the port and do a reconnaissance to find out what's there. Upon arriving at the port, Trevor comes across the cargo ship that has been sitting there for days. He takes several photos and sends them to one of his henchmen, Ron. That guy who appeared right at the beginning. Ron is practically an expert in radio station reconnaissance, among other things, and he tells Trevor that this is something big, like military level stuff. Trevor then talks to Floyd to get more information and discovers that he really has military equipment from a company called Merryweather. This company called Merryweather is basically a private army, but like a FedEx, right? They deliver things for powerful people, for powerful companies, things like that. That's why it's basically an army, because they are carrying super valuable cargo, which is the case of this super weapon that Trevor was now trying to steal. Trevor then begins to orchestrate a mega heist to try to steal this weapon, which if successful, he will be able to sell for an average of $20 million, and this weapon would be sold to the Chinese. Trevor calls Michael and Franklin because he already knows their skills with heist, and after all the preparations, they start and actually carry out a heist where they destroy this cargo ship and go search in the wreckage for what would be this supposed super weapon. They manage to steal this weapon and even put it on top of the truck to escape with it and take it to where Trevor negotiated with the Chinese. However, before they leave, Lester, who was in a clinic hospitalized, as I said, Lester was sick, he has some body problems, etc. Later, he leaves the clinic and goes straight there, still in his hospital clothes, to tell them to return that weapon because if they kept it, they would get into big trouble with everyone. The government would come after them with force. They wouldn't last even a few days because that there, as I said, is military level stuff. It was like a super nuclear weapon, a fusion reactor if I'm not mistaken, or something like that. In other words, it was a very dangerous and advanced equipment. And on top of that, it would be sold to the Chinese, with whom the United States in a way is in a bit of a conflict. After resisting a little bit, Trevor ends up giving in to Lester's pressure, but only when Michael tells him that he will still arrange some heist for him, something good so Trevor could make some good money and thus get rid of that problem, which would be a big one. So with that, Trevor agrees. They put the super weapon back in the middle of the wreckage of the ship that was destroyed to pretend it was just an accident and not a robbery, with teams and so on. They leave afterwards, and from this Merryweather robbery, they don't earn anything. At least not from this first heist. After that, they are contacted by FIB again, who now want another job. This other job involves stealing some sensitive documents and delivering them to a guy named Devin Weston. This Devin Weston first appears in the scene where they torture that guy, Ferdinand Karamov, and now Steve Haynes is working for this guy who would be delivering these sensitive documents that seem to be public titles or bearer shares. The game makes it 100% clear what it is about. However, the heist needs to be well orchestrated. For this, it needed to be something more complex to do than just robbing an armored car. So after several preparations, the heist is finally executed and Michael is in charge of taking these documents to Devin Weston's mansion, which is a gigantic mansion in the mountains. 65. Upon arriving there, Devin Weston suggests to Michael that he could work for him. Michael immediately refuses, says he doesn't want to do any job for Devin, etc. However, at this point, Devin already knew Michael's weakness. He already knew some of Michael's tastes, and Michael's main taste was for old movies. Do you remember when I told you about him dropping lines from old movies, especially during heists? Well, that's because Michael is a big fan of those cliche Hollywood movies, etc. And then Devin tells Michael that if he helps him with some heists, he can introduce Michael to a very influential guy in the world of movies, a film producer named Solomon Richards. At that moment, Michael ends up giving in to the pressure and agreeing, as Devin was very spot on in giving Michael exactly what he wanted. Michael then starts organizing vehicle thefts for Devin, calling Franklin to do these thefts, since Franklin actually had more experience in the subject and was a better driver than Michael. And after calling Franklin, Michael goes straight to meet Solomon Richards, who needs several favors to help with the completion of a movie called Meltdown. The first favor is to ask Michael to pick up one of the actors who is backing out of the film. The guy basically wants double the value to continue shooting, even though they had already signed a contract. Michael then goes there, fights with the guy, and then takes everyone on a terrifying helicopter ride and makes everyone return to the film production immediately. While that's going on, Franklin is negotiating with Lester before the car theft, and these negotiations involve more hits on the stock exchange with other murders. Do you remember that Michael killed the guy from Life Invader, right? He sabotaged that phone for Lester to make an investment in the game's stocks. Now Lester is also asking the same thing from Franklin, so Franklin starts to do a series of strategically coordinated assassinations by Lester so they can make various investments in the stock exchange, whether they're going to kill or not, right? And this makes the stock price fluctuate, allowing them to always buy low and sell high. After the first murder, Lester gives Franklin a house in Vinewood Hills to help with tax issues related to money laundering and investments that Lester was making. After carrying out all the hits for Lester, Franklin then moves on to the first vehicle heist for Devin Weston. They have to steal a total of 5 vehicles for this guy, and this first heist they're going to do will already involve 2 vehicles. To organize this heist, Franklin pretends to be a guy wanting to race with a fancy car, and he would meet 2 playboys who also have these 2 cars they want. Michael and Trevor dress up as highway patrol officers and supposedly will frame these guys after the race. And when they're framed, that's when they'll steal the vehicle. And then these two vehicles are very easy to steal. The next vehicle is an extremely rare car from a guy named Chad Mulligan. To pull off this heist, only Trevor and Franklin are needed, Franklin on the ground and Trevor above, tracking the car with a helicopter. After a while in the police helicopter trying to catch that guy, they finally manage to locate him, and after a huge getaway, a huge chase, they also managed to steal this third vehicle for Devin Weston. With that, 3 cars have already been stolen. And in the middle of all this vehicle theft mess, now there's a guy calling Michael again, but not to pick a fight, but to ask for a favor. This guy is Martin Madrazo, the same Mexican drug dealer who had beaten up Michael. He sends a message to Michael saying that he has a job for him, and since Michael doesn't want to involve Franklin in this, especially because Franklin is there stealing the vehicles, Michael ends up calling Trevor to go with him. So Michael and Trevor go to Martin Madrazo's house, which is a ranch outside the city of Los Santos, to understand his proposal, what he needs. Martin then informs that one of his cousins, who was one of his henchmen, is now on his way to testify against him, and that's why he needs to get rid of this guy, but it needs to look like an accident. 71. So what he needs Michael to do is basically climb to the top of a mountain where there will already be a van with a super weapon inside waiting for him. With that, he will take 3 shots at the airplane's turbine to make it look like a bird flew into the turbine and destroyed it. When the plane is falling, Trevor will chase after this plane on a motorcycle, and when the plane crashes to the ground, Trevor will kill any survivors and steal all the documents and evidence. With that done, Trevor now has to take these documents to Martin Madrazo's house, and this is where one of Michael's biggest nightmares begins, because what you've seen from Trevor so far is child's play, my friend. After destroying the van with the weapon, Michael decides to go to the meeting point where he should now meet with Trevor. However, Trevor ends up calling Michael and tells him to meet somewhere else because something has happened that he prefers to talk about in person. When he gets there, Trevor starts telling a story, telling Michael that he went to collect from Martin Madrazo about the payment. And Martin Madrazo got angry with that, and he also got angry, and that's when things heated up. Michael immediately thinks that Trevor killed Martin Madrazo and asks him directly, knowing that it would generate a big retaliation from the Mexican mafia. He even gets scared and asks Trevor what happened. Trevor said he didn't kill Martin Madrazo because he's not some kind of animal, but instead, what he did was kidnap Martin Madrazo's wife. And at that exact moment, Michael finds himself forced to flee with Trevor to Sandy Shores, which is basically out in the desert, out in the countryside, so they can hide from Martin Madrazo, since Martin Madrazo swore to kill them if they were to show up in Los Santos again. They would die. Luckily for Michael, at that exact moment, his family had abandoned him, so there was no one at his house to be taken hostage or anything like that, which helps Michael to stay hidden quietly. And it is also important to make it clear that Trevor did not kidnap Martin Madrazo's wife, whose name is Patricia, just because he did not receive any payment. He kidnapped her because, in fact, from the beginning, he has a crush on her. He simply finds her beautiful and wonderful, even though it makes no sense. So after the kidnapping, they go to Sandy Shores and hide while Franklin stays calm in Los Santos, continuing with vehicle thefts for Devin Weston. The next vehicle, now the 4th vehicle to be stolen, is a vehicle being used in action movie shoots. So for that, Franklin enters this recording studio, pretends to be the actor, after stealing his clothes, gets into the car and drives off with it. After escaping and shaking off the cinema security and so on, he receives a call from Devin Weston's assistant, named Molly Schultz. This Molly says there is a guy lurking around where the cars are being delivered and that Franklin should be careful, maybe even solve this problem. When Franklin arrives there, indeed, with the 4th car, he doesn't see anyone. So he enters the garage and hands over the car to Devin Weston, and during the conversation they are having, who shows up there is Lamar. Lamar noticed that something was going on and went there and waited to see if Franklin would show up, because he was already suspicious of these thefts. And indeed, as Franklin showed up, he went there and ended up talking to Devin Weston and Franklin. And Devin ended up suggesting that Lamar also participate in the last vehicle theft that will happen in a while. And even though Franklin was a little reluctant and so on, the two kind of ended up agreeing, and Lamar will participate in the last theft. However, the last theft was still not in the plan. It is not ready yet, which brings us back to the situation where Michael and Trevor are in the desert. Out in the desert, they basically can let Patricia loose because she's not going to run away. She's a lady, must be like 60 years old, so she doesn't have the energy, and maybe possibly even has a fear of trying to escape and ending up dead. So what she does there is resign herself to the situation and basically starts becoming a maid inside that trailer, because Trevor Trevor's house is a mess. She starts cleaning everything and so on. Meanwhile, Trevor keeps pressing Ron, who lives next to his house, about some new job or something that's on the radar nearby. And then Ron brings up the idea of stealing again from Merryweather, the same one that had the super weapon on the ship. Since they make various deliveries, they don't just deliver via ship, they also deliver via planes, train, and so on. And now, what Trevor would try to steal would be a plane full of weapons. Trevor then, with Ron's information, he takes a crop duster plane and goes after a mega gigantic plane. After killing several soldiers inside the plane, he actually manages to steal the plane and take control. However, this plane is shot down by the National Force, as it represented a risk, and there were various weapons on board, and the only solution would be to really shoot down that plane. So they wait for Trevor to enter the country's rural area, where casualties would be lower on the ground. They shoot missiles, causing the plane to crash, and those weapons to be 100% useless, unable to be sold, as no one will retrieve weapons from the bottom of the sea. Trevor jumps out of the plane before it actually crashes and explodes, leading Trevor to a new search for other things and calling Ron again. For that, this time Ron, instead of suggesting something in the air, which would be very complicated as they saw, he suggested something easier, which would be the robbery of a train. This train also has cargo from the same company, Merryweather, meaning there are valuable products there. Trevor then talks to Michael and they decide to organize this robbery. However, Michael is interested in robbing this train to see if there is anything valuable there, so that he can negotiate with the Mexican trafficker, Martin Madrazo, delivering it as a gift and then returning his wife immediately afterwards to see if he could return to Los Santos, because until then, he was a dead man. Michael then helps Trevor organize and carry out the robbery, where they make two trains collide in an epic scene. Michael destroys the container and steals what he thinks would be interesting to deliver to Martin Madrazo. After a huge shootout with Merryweather, they finally manage to escape, and that's when Michael shows Trevor what he managed to steal, and that he was interested in delivering it to Martin Madrazo as a peace offering, so that he could finally return to Los Santos and live with his family possibly. Trevor doesn't agree because for him, he organized that heist. Trevor himself organized that heist, so that robbery, that loot, is his. However, Michael manages to be more convincing since he wanted to go back home. He tells Trevor that if Trevor lets him handle that business, that statue he will give as a gift, Michael would give Trevor something much more valuable, and that would be the Union Depository heist. Trevor is skeptical at first because that Union Depository heist is the one that Lester mentioned at the beginning, and even Michael is skeptical. However, Michael tells Trevor that he never said it was impossible, just that it would be very difficult to rob that bank that holds the National Reserve, and that if Trevor handed over that statue to him, he would find a way to organize everything and make that Union Depository heist happen, which they called the Big Score. Trevor then resists a bit, but hands over the statue to Michael, and Michael gives this statue to Lester, so Lester can negotiate with Martin Madrazo. And then, when the guy accepts, Trevor should take Martin Madrazo's wife back to him. While Trevor and Michael were out in the Sandy Shores desert, doing all sorts of things, Franklin ends up calling Trevor to say that there are some guys looking for him in Los Santos. There are some guys looking for Trevor. Trevor then suspects that these guys are the last O'Neill brothers, who are the guys he killed a bunch of inside the house and even blew up their lab at the beginning for messing up his deal with the Chinese. As not all the brothers were there, some were still alive, and these guys were looking for Trevor in Los Santos. However, since Trevor was hiding in Sandy Shores, Franklin found out that people were looking for Trevor. Franklin followed these guys and called Michael and Trevor for help. After a while, in the middle of the forest, Franklin, Michael, and Trevor managed to put an end to all the O'Neill brothers and leave that whole chapter behind. So once again, they are contacted by the EFIB. In the meantime, Lester is still negotiating with Martin Madrazo, but the deal hasn't gone through yet. So basically, all that's left for Michael and Trevor is to stay hidden in Sandy Shores. Now, the FIB has decided to go to the desert to talk to them about a new job, but this time it was a huge messed up job, because remember when I told you guys about the secret war of funding between the IAA and the FIB? Well, this thing was reaching a whole new level. In this war for their own funding, the IAA was planning a terrorist attack on the United States so that they could intervene in some way. In other words, they were producing a terrorist toxin that would kill thousands of people, maybe millions, so that it would generate more terrorism, and with that generated terrorism, they would have more funding, because in theory, if there's no terrorism, why fund anti-terrorism? It wouldn't make sense. So, with this information, Steve Haynes and Dave Norton, kind of like heroes, want to prevent the IAA from doing this job and killing millions of people, but they don't have enough money or resources to invade this high security laboratory, which is called the Humane Lab. So to raise funds, they call Michael, Trevor, and Franklin and tell them that they now have to pull off a new heist, no matter where it is, so that they can raise enough money to gather resources and invade the lab. Michael then remembers that when he contacted Lester back in Los Santos, Lester mentioned a bank in the countryside. Michael calls Lester to inquire about this first bank he had mentioned. However, he was somewhat skeptical that a bank in the interior of the state could have enough money to finance a heist of this magnitude. Trevor was with him and states that that bank will have all that money because that bank is a corrupt bank. It holds millions of dollars there from people who make magical substances or other drugs for corrupt cops. So there should really be all that cash there. However, in order to pull off a heist there, after doing the reconnaissance with Lester and Trevor, they realized that the police response time there is much faster, as the corrupt cops are keeping a close eye. They don't want to be robbed, and the only way for them to pull off this heist is to confront the police head-on. So they steal top-of-the-line military equipment like bulletproof vests from head to toe, invade the bank, and initiate a heist that results in a robbery of $8 million, where Michael, Trevor, Franklin, and one more hired helper escape with bags of money in an insane shootout against the cops. In setting up this heist, Trevor, Michael, and the accomplice find themselves in the middle of a shootout, while Franklin is arranging the getaway with a boat nearby. However, as the entire area ends up being sealed off, the boat escape becomes unfeasible. As a result, Franklin finds another way to flee, stealing a backhoe and leading the team members to a burger factory where they engage in a fierce shootout with army soldiers and manage to escape on a train passing behind the factory. They are stopped a few stations ahead by one of the corrupt agents from the FIB, Andreas Sanchez, who was introduced way back at the beginning alongside Steve Haynes. Andreas takes almost all the money, leaving only a small portion for Trevor, Michael, and Franklin, while the rest of the funds would be used to purchase a helicopter, maybe some weaponry, and a few other items to be used in the invasion of the laboratory producing that toxin. After a few days, they finish organizing everything, and now they meet to invade this laboratory that has to be invaded through the sewage outlet in the sea. Steve Haynes ends up having a disagreement with Michael at that moment, as he said there should be 6 people to pull off that heist and that he told Michael that. However, after a few minutes of conversation, it becomes clear that Steve Haynes did not say that. And after much discussion, Steve Haynes and Dave Norton decide to participate in the heist, helping Michael to invade the laboratory, as it was the only way for Michael to go since he wouldn't go in there alone. So they go together, invade the laboratory, Michael, Dave Norton, and Steve Haynes, while Trevor goes to get the helicopter and Franklin goes to get, if I'm not mistaken, the truck to later store the container with the toxin. They break into the lab and start by using non-lethal ammunition, only shock ammunition, so they don't have to kill the scientists, who are not guilty of what is being done there, as they are just following orders. After threatening some scientists, they finally gain access to the lethal toxin. Now they have to get out of the lab as soon as possible. The problem is that when they grab the toxin, the alarm starts blaring, and as a result, a massive shootout begins. The talk of non-lethal ammunition is over. After facing a very strong resistance to get out of that place and put the vial in the container outside, which will already be waiting to be refrigerated, because if that toxin stayed out of refrigeration for too long, it could explode. They do all of this very quickly. Trevor arrives to pick up the container with the cargo bob helicopter. However, everything was happening very quickly, and the IA agents were already arriving to prevent the theft of the toxin. In the face of this, Steve Haynes ends up having the idea of staying down there and shooting himself in the leg to pass as a double agent. With that, he would be able to stall the people there and create another version of the story, so that the team could gain a little time, as little as it may be, for Trevor to be able to escape with that toxin. After he manages to escape and put it in the truck, basically that happens very successfully. While all this heist was happening, with all this commotion, Lester finally finalizes the negotiation with Martin Madrazo. Now, after all this hit on the humane labs, Trevor has to take Patricia back to her home. And the interesting thing here is that this is one of the few moments where we can see Trevor actually cry, because during the time he kidnapped Patricia, they were together, and Martin Madrazo's wife ends up developing a relationship with Trevor where they have space to be together, etc. And that's why Trevor was crying, because he was really letting go of someone he loved. Upon arriving at Martin Madrazo's house at the ranch, we realized that on that day, Trevor not only had a falling out with Martin Madrazo, but he also did something to his ear, like ripping it off, biting it, or something like that. I'm not exactly sure what it is. The only thing that is certain is that he attacked Martin Madrazo before kidnapping his wife. And yet, Martin Madrazo decided not to retaliate after getting his wife back, which implies that he was very afraid of Trevor. This implies that what happened on the day Trevor went to get Martin Madrazo's wife was a very heavy matter. Now, with this Martin Madrazo issue resolved, they can go back to Los Santos freely. Michael to try to get his family back, and Trevor to continue with everything he was doing before. So that's basically what happens. Trevor goes straight back to Floyd's apartment where he used to live. The problem is that this time when he gets there, it's not just Floyd. His wife, Debra, is also there, and she does not want to see Trevor there at all. This is where a big argument starts, and the three of them are getting more and more stressed. The tension rises and rises until Floyd grabs a knife and Debra grabs a gun hidden in the drawer. With that, Trevor is basically cornered, and the scene simply simply cuts to a black screen. And when we see him again, we can see Trevor leaving Floyd's house completely bloodied after leaving 2 bodies inside the house. The issue here is that as Trevor is leaving the house, Wade, who is Floyd's cousin, shows up there to try to talk to Floyd. Since Trevor knew that now Deborah and Floyd are dead, Trevor lied to Wade, saying that there was no one at home and that he called Floyd, and Floyd said they would meet at the strip club, which was a complete lie. There was a brutal murder that happened there, as suggested by the radio that the man died from a gunshot. In other words, Deborah probably accidentally shot Floyd, and then Trevor took the knife from Floyd's hand and stabbed Deborah to death. So Trevor, in order to escape from the crime scene, takes Wade to the strip club and goes to talk directly to the club manager, where he proposes a certain partnership that ends up not being accepted by the manager. So Trevor kills the guy and hides him in the fridge so that no one finds out what actually happened there. Meanwhile, he starts taking over that strip club as if it were his own home. Now that Trevor has a new operational base, a place to call home, he ends up confronting Michael, in a way drawing his attention to the heist that Michael had promised him in the desert, the big heist, the Union Depository heist. So they decide to call Lester to analyze how this heist could be done. Lester gives them 2 options here, one that would be a little more aggressive but would require less team and more weaponry, and another one a little more subtle, which we will talk about a little later after planning the heist. And after doing reconnaissance to plan the heist, we see Trevor's extreme commitment to trying to get Brad out of prison. So he keeps talking directly to Lester to see if Lester can come up with a plan for them to break into the prison and get Brad out of there. Lester tells Trevor to look for Michael and have a conversation about it. So basically that's what Trevor decides to do. He waits for the reconnaissance of the heist to finish and for Lester to start having some ideas before dropping by Michael's place to talk. And then he does try to convince Michael to join that rescue mission where they would end up rescuing Brad, who was imprisoned. However, when he arrives at Michael's house, Trevor sees that the conversation is not going very well. Michael doesn't see much sense in supposedly freeing Brad from prison and makes it very clear to Trevor that their partnership only goes up to that last heist, the Union Depository heist, which is the heist Michael promised. After that, Michael would indeed retire and start working with movies, which is his dream. Trevor then gets extremely furious because Trevor believes that Michael is excluding him from his life. And then, out of nowhere, basically a few dots in Trevor's head connect, and Trevor at that exact moment asks a very simple question to Michael, which is, who is buried in his grave, which was made there in 2004 in North Yankton? Who would be the person buried there? Because in fact, this was never told. Michael then, at that moment, simply says he doesn't know who it is and tries to change the subject, saying it was just a nobody. Trevor was already too suspicious of the whole story Michael told, of all the versions Michael told. So he runs out of Michael's house, steals Michael's car at that moment, and goes straight to his private airport, which he stole from the Lost MC a while back, and flies straight to North Yankton. Meanwhile, Michael, afraid of Trevor finding out the truth, also flies to North Yankton to try to convince Trevor not to possibly look at his grave or dig up old problems. Still, arriving in North Yankton, the two argue a bit and Trevor keeps digging until he reaches the coffin where Michael was supposed to be buried. When he opens it, he sees that in fact Brad is buried in the place where Michael should be. And here comes a very interesting detail, because up to that point, people who were paying attention to the dialogues, especially those on the phone, believed that Brad was alive inside a maximum security prison, as he talked to Trevor, sent messages, replied, and so on. So, at that moment when Trevor saw that Brad was buried, he realized that someone was impersonating Brad because Brad was there dead in front of him, and it had been a long time since Brad had been decomposing. And as Michael was alive and so on, he became certain that Michael betrayed him in some way. He may not have known exactly how at that moment, but he knew that Michael betrayed him. And then they began a huge argument, ending up pointing their guns at each other in a massive showdown.
You reptilian motherfucker!
I didn't want it to come to this.
Yes, you did! You just don't have the fucking balls to do it! But I do!
I got more to lose than you.
Never a truer word has been spoken, brother! Now pull the fucking trigger! You ain't got the guts. Take the fucking shot! Who is that? Fuck!
97. The big issue here is that when Michael went after Trevor in North Yankton just before he entered the airport, there were people following Michael. In fact, they had been under surveillance for a long time, since the time when Patricia was living with them in the Sandy Shores trailer. The ones watching them were the Chinese mafia, the same mafia that Trevor ended up disrupting their plans by not doing business with them and even assaulting the boss's son, Tao Cheng. And at that moment in North Yankton, where they are pointing the gun at each other, there are several Chinese men arriving, several henchmen of the Chinese triad, ready to capture both Trevor and Michael, who they thought up to that point were a couple as they were together in a trailer, and they thought Patricia, Martin Madrazo's wife who had been kidnapped, was simply a maid and that Michael and Trevor were lovers, etc. 98. They go to North Yankton to try to capture Trevor. However, Trevor manages to escape after fighting with Michael, and Michael gets into a massive shootout, killing several Chinese triad henchmen until he is captured in the end. While he is captured, Trevor manages to escape from North Yankton and return to Los Santos as if nothing had happened. Upon arriving in Los Santos, Trevor sets out to find Franklin, who at that exact moment is going to do the last vehicle theft for Devin Weston. There were 5 vehicles they had already stolen 4, and he was in the process of stealing the 5th vehicle. The 5th theft had actually already been done by Lamar at that moment. Franklin was just helping to collect the vehicle, while Trevor was collecting the other vehicles and putting them inside the car carrier truck. But everything seems too easy for Lamar. He manages to steal the 5th car smoothly, and as it seems, that car was already left as bait to catch these supposed thieves who were stealing luxury vehicles around the city, because at the moment they start to leave the city, where no one was behind them, at the moment they pass a certain location, the police are already waiting for them, ready to apprehend all of them. The reason they wait to leave the city is a case of a possible shootout, which ends up happening but outside the city. The chance of a stray bullet hitting someone is lower. After a big shootout, with the police chasing the truck and so on, they finally managed to get rid of the police and deliver the 5 stolen vehicles to Devin Weston. And after delivering those 5 vehicles, Franklin comes across Molly, who is Devin Weston's assistant, who tells him that everything is very risky at that moment and that making a high-value transaction from Devin Weston's account to them would attract a lot of attention. Therefore, Devin Weston was going to take all that money from the vehicles and invest it, which was actually a big lie. Devin Weston was simply scamming them. Since Franklin wouldn't have anything to do about it at that moment, he basically accepted it because he had already stolen the cars and couldn't keep those cars at that moment. It would be evidence against him. So he decides to return to Los Santos as if nothing had happened to try to resolve this later. 101. During this trip there, Trevor ends up telling Lamar what happened to Michael, that he was possibly kidnapped and so on, but he doesn't know exactly what happened to Michael. His situation is not confirmed, whether he is alive or dead, etc. But Trevor doesn't tell anything to Franklin. Trevor only tells Lamar. Franklin later on begins to suspect that there is something wrong with Michael and ends up talking to Trevor when they meet. Trevor gets very stressed when they talk about it and ends up giving some clues about what possibly happened to Michael. With that, Franklin immediately calls Lester, and Lester is able to track Michael's cell phone, saying that there was a signal spike in Los Santos and that he will send an app for Franklin to be able to track where that place with the signal was, so that he could maybe find out where Michael was and rescue him. While Franklin was trying to find out where Michael was being interrogated by Wei Cheng, who is the leader of the Chinese triad, the guy's father who ended up getting beaten up by Trevor because he wanted to capture Trevor, and in the end he couldn't. So he captured Michael, thinking Trevor and Michael were lovers and that Trevor would come back for Michael, which didn't happen. So he leaves Michael to die. Then Franklin manages to arrive in time and save Michael after a big shootout inside a butcher shop, killing many members of the Chinese triad there, in addition to those who died in North Yankton. After rescuing Michael, who was completely messed up, Franklin asks him what happened. When Franklin arrives at Michael's house and leaves him there, Franklin asks who Brad was and what happened in 2004. What was the story with the FIB that Michael had, and so on. Michael always used to lie and stuff, but this time he decides to open up a little with Franklin, telling him that they used to be a trio, Michael, Trevor, and Brad. But Michael was pretty much cornered. He had 2 kids, a wife, he had a family to raise, and Trevor and Brad were 2 crazy guys, and seeing that they were nuts, he had to find a way out of that. That's when he ended up making a deal with Dave Norton. That was the way out he found, and ended up betraying his companion. Obviously, Michael doesn't tell exactly how it should have been, and how everything was orchestrated, etc. Franklin still doesn't discover 100% of the truth. Michael's intention in the prologue was for Trevor to die, and for Brad to take the shot and get caught, or for Brad to die as well. And then Dave Norton would get all the glory for supposedly killing Michael Townley, while Dave Norton would be receiving 5 digits per month from Michael forever. Franklin repudiates everything that happened, everything Michael says. However, he ends up letting it go because he understands that this is a problem between Michael and Trevor, and he knows that Trevor will come back to them once they resolve that.
Look, man, before you go, what the fuck happened up there?
I said, Trevor went crazy, tried to kill me, I got jumped by the Chinese.
Man, before all that, I'm talking about the feds. Trevor, this guy Brad, man.
I know what you meant. All right, look, I made a judgment call. I don't know if it was the right one. I did what I thought I had to do. I had a young family, Franklin. I was running with a crew of crazy motherfuckers with nothing to lose. I saw an out. A future for me, for my family. I took it.
You took it? Man, you burned every motherfucker you've ever known.
It was that or die. Look, I know it sounds cold. I don't expect you to understand it. Not yet, but you will. When you got ties of your own. Look, you wake up one day, and your legs, they just give. You just can't run anymore.
Michael takes the day off to rest, as he would also have some obligations the next day, which are favors for Solomon Richard, that guy from the movie theater. Upon arriving at the cinema, he sees Solomon Richard being beaten up by one of the actors that Michael had picked up that time in the helicopter and such. Since these guys saw that Michael was away for a while, they had beaten up Solomon Richards because of what he asked Michael to do with them. As Michael arrives right at the act, he gets furious and decides to kill these two guys. And after killing the two guys, Michael is contacted again by the FIB. You see that the FIB is making Michael's life hell, right? However, now they are promising that this really is the last job, that if Michael does this job for them, they will never bother Michael again. Michael decides to go there to see what it would be, and the job is basically a crazy thing. What Steve Haynes and Dave Norton want from Michael, Franklin, and Trevor is for them to break into an FIB facility, which is in an inaccessible part for them, to which they do not have access, to steal data. This could be done in two ways. According to Lester, it can be done quietly, entering through the helicopter roof right in the middle of the night, or it can be done by causing several explosions and confusing the staff, making them enter as firefighters, which is the option I like the most for this heist. Therefore, you need, for the preparation of the heist, a fire truck and a few other things, such as the janitor's uniform and a badge, so that Lester can fake Michael's entry, since he will have to enter as a janitor. The plan is, once Michael manages to get inside the building as a janitor, he plants explosives inside. So what Michael needs to do first is go to an FIB parking garage and wait for one of the janitors to leave. With that, they already have everything planned out. They will approach this guy, take his clothes, badge, and leave. After that, and after getting all the other preparations, they decide to actually execute this heist. Michael goes to the FIB building, enters as a janitor, and does some cleaning, because he really has to do the cleaning. Otherwise, people will notice through the camera that he is not cleaning and will suspect him. While he is cleaning, he places adhesive bombs in strategic points of the building. And after Michael's shift ends as a janitor, he leaves, gets into the nearby fire truck, and when they believe it's the right moment, they detonate all the bombs up there. 108Q, when the bombs are detonated, Lester intercepts the fire department's call signal so that no other firefighters would come, and only Michael and his team can enter there as supposed firefighters. So they do that, enter the server room, steal all the confidential information on the hard drive, and get out of there. As they are leaving, some of the agents find out that they are not real firefighters, which results in a slight shootout, but nothing they can't handle naturally. When they finally manage to leave the building, they get into the fire truck and drive away smoothly. They destroy the truck to leave no trace and manage to actually escape. However, this time, besides stealing all the data that Steve Haynes and Dave Norton requested, they also managed to steal all the data related to Michael's own record, all data regarding Michael's past, agreements, etc., so that people couldn't now blackmail Michael again. With all that then, is everything okay with the FIB, right? Dave Norton now calls Michael again and asks to meet, this time in another location. Dave Norton will be at this location waiting to talk to Michael, but before this meeting that Dave Norton is waiting for, Solomon Richards also calls Michael. He said he is having trouble at the studio and needs Michael's help urgently. Arriving there, Michael sees Solomon Richard talking to Devin Weston and his secretary, Molly Schultz. They are stealing the film that took so much effort to produce. Michael beat up actors, killed actors, and they want to take this copy of the film and take it out of the country, claim that the film was destroyed so they could get the insurance money, which would be a huge fortune since the film was almost ready. So, Molly takes the movie copy from Solomon Richards' hands and flees, taking all his work with all his love for cinema, etc. Michael immediately goes after Molly in a frantic chase that ends up destroying several police vehicles, even inside the airport. When Molly finally manages to reach Devin Weston's hangar, where she would board the plane to escape the country, the plane's turbine is turned on just as Molly is passing by, and the turbine sucks Molly in, causing her to die instantly, being shredded. The film reel falls to the ground and Michael manages to retrieve the film. However, after recovering the film and escaping from the police and the crime scene, Michael discovers that it was not the only copy of the film, and that there were other copies of the film out there, and that Solomon Richards was letting Molly believe she was taking the only version out. But now there was nothing more to do. The mess was already done, and Devin Weston's secretary, Molly Schultz, by that time was already dead. That said, Michael goes back home to wait for things to calm down a bit, and after resting, he goes to the court center to meet Dave Norton, who had called him before Solomon Richards. Arriving at the court center, Michael understands that it will be a very calm conversation, and you can see that Dave Norton and Michael respect each other and neither wants to cause trouble for the other anymore. However, the big problem here is that Steve Haynes is pressuring Dave Norton to the max. That's why Dave Norton keeps bothering Michael. At this moment, Steve Haynes also appears with Andreas Sanchez, and a discussion begins. Michael, Steve, Andreas, and Dave Norton. Because Steve Haynes is now on thin ice, practically by the neck. People suspect that Steve Haynes was behind scams like FIB and the Humane Labs heist. And now Steve Haynes, even after everything Michael did for him, still wants more favors from Michael. However, just like in the last heist, Michael managed to wipe his record clean, steal all the data. Michael doesn't want to do these jobs for Steve Haynes anymore because he knows he can't be blackmailed anymore. And that's where they hit a major roadblock. Steve Haynes tells Andreas Sanchez to arrest Michael. At that moment, Dave Norton points a gun at Andreas Sanchez so he doesn't arrest Michael because he agreed they would resolve it peacefully, like gentlemen. However, in the midst of all this conflict and standoff, the IAA team shows up. Along with the IAA team who arrived from one side, another division of the EFIB arrives from the other side. This other division of the FIB was with Andreas Sanchez, who has now revealed himself to be a major double agent, who was actually investigating Steve Haynes and Dave Norton from the inside, 113. And at the moment of the discovery of this betrayal by one of the agents, you can also see a Merryweather helicopter there, which was most likely after Michael. Faced with all this tension, one of the IAA agents ends up shooting Steve Haynes in the leg, right in the leg he had shot in the Humane Labs. Kneeling down, Steve Haynes ends up shooting Agent Sanchez right in the head, who had just found out he had betrayed him, and he got really mad about it. This all results in a huge shootout, where Dave Norton escapes from that place, and everyone goes their separate ways. Michael starts an intense shootout against Merryweather to escape the scene, and just when Michael is practically cornered, surrounded by multiple soldiers, along with Dave Norton, an unexpected help appears for him. Trevor Phillips himself, who had left Michael to die back in Ludendorff, North Yankton. Trevor shouts from afar and states that if anyone is going to kill Michael, it would be Trevor himself. And at that moment, Trevor starts killing several soldiers who were trying to kill Michael so that they could maybe understand each other. Michael doesn't really understand what's going on there with Trevor, etc. But still, he accepts the help and manages to escape from that place along with Dave Norton after a lot of shooting against Merryweather. And maybe you're wondering why Merryweather was so after Michael and Trevor? It's because they were constantly robbing them. Michael and Trevor stole the truck, ship, train, and even the plane of that company. So these guys wanted to take care of them, wanted to end them, but even so, they still managed to escape. And after the shootout at the court center, Michael ends up meeting with Trevor there in Los Santos after all the gunfire. In this conversation, where Trevor talks to Michael after all of this, it becomes clear that Trevor only wants one thing from Michael, what Michael promised him. The Union Depository heist. That's simply why Trevor came back, because he knows that basically he can't pull off that heist without Michael, and Michael most likely can't do it without him. Michael, once again cornered with no options, knowing he will get into even bigger trouble with Trevor if he doesn't agree, he decides to go through with the heist and calls Lester to continue with the preparations. While Lester starts planning again how the heist will go down, Michael goes back home, drinks a lot, gets wasted, and falls asleep on the couch. When he wakes up, his son Jimmy is there, basically feeling sorry for him. They talk and quickly settle some things there, because as much as Jimmy didn't like Michael's reactions, he was still his father and missed that. So he says that Amanda also misses Michael and that they should sort things out. With that, Jimmy ends up telling Michael where Amanda is. Michael goes there and finds her at a coffee shop near his house, where he ends up beating up that same yoga instructor who was seeing her. They were really getting involved. After that, he goes to pick up his daughter, who is at the tattoo studio, this time with the same guy who is the host of that show from the beginning, Fame or Shame. This guy's name is Laszlo. This guy is basically telling Tracy that if she does sexual favors for him, he will put her back on the show. 117, the Michael stands outside listening to see how the conversation goes, if she would agree or not, or what could happen. And when he realizes that something is really going on there, he intervenes and ends up catching Laszlo undressing him, putting on several piercings, tattoos, etc., and saying that he will make her return to the show and that he has to do it, or Michael will go after him. After all this drama with Tracy, Michael goes to his therapist along with Amanda, Tracy, and Jimmy, where they manage to settle things to start living together again. After that, Michael takes some time to rest, and now we'll see a little bit of what's going on in Franklin's life. He's at home chilling, and suddenly the doorbell rings. Who shows up at the door is his ex-girlfriend Tanisha. Tanisha left Franklin a long time ago because she hates the gang world. Her brother died because of it, and most likely Franklin was involved in that. That's why she didn't want anything to do with criminals anymore. However, she didn't go there to try to get back together with Franklin or anything like that. She went there to tell Franklin that Lamar, Franklin's troublemaking best friend, was taken to die in a sawmill in Paleto Bay, out in the countryside suicide and that it's Franklin's duty to help Lamar. Franklin hesitates a bit because he feels like he's not obligated to do that, but Tanisha ends up talking to him, leaving him with a heavy conscience. After that, Franklin calls Lester to see if Lester can track down the location where Lamar would be, and after getting the location, he calls Michael and Trevor to help because he knew it was going to be a huge shootout, just insane. The two then agree and they have a meeting point very close to the sawmill where Lamar was ambushed. Arriving there, it's clear that the atmosphere is very strange between Trevor and Michael. Even though Trevor no longer wants to kill Michael, you can see Trevor constantly hinting that Michael is a traitor. However, even so, at that moment, to help Lamar, who had been ambushed, they decide to put their differences aside and act in order to help Franklin. With that, they invade that sawmill, killing several members of the Ballas gang and manage to rescue Lamar, leaving a huge mess in the enemy gang. I-120. Franklin actually manages to escape with Lamar after a while, and during their getaway, Franklin and Lamar are talking about what happened, etc. All of this makes it very clear that it was Stretch who set Lamar up, and that delivering Lamar to the Ballas was Stretch's way of settling things with the Ballas so that the beef from the beginning wouldn't escalate into a gang war. Everyone knew that Stretch wanted to kill Lamar, even Tanisha knew, and she wasn't even part of the gang world anymore. In other words, everyone knew that Stretch was a traitor now. After a lot of arguing, etc., Franklin ends up leaving Lamar there in Los Santos, and after giving Lamar some money, he ends up being confronted by two people, Steve Haynes and Dave Norton, not over the phone but in person. I'm Ninan P phone Jiang Yun 121. Steve Haynes and Dave Norton once again want something else from Franklin, and that would basically be for Franklin to kill Trevor. This is because Trevor is an unstable guy, and they no longer had a way to keep Trevor or Michael in line. So they wanted Franklin to get rid of Trevor because they knew they could somehow control Michael. At the moment, Franklin completely denies it because, let's say up until then, he wouldn't be able to do that, right? Going against Trevor would kind of be crazy. And he decides to tell them to screw off. In other words, basically later he will see if it is necessary to do something like that against Trevor, but for now he decides not to do anything.
Hey, when the timing's right, you're gonna take old Trevor and put him out to pasture, homie.
Michael will be sensible, but Trevor won't be.
Trevor is a liability that none of us can afford.
Man, Trevor saved you. He saved both y'all asses.
And it's unfortunate.
Hey, when we give you the word, you're gonna do this.
After that, a few days passed, Michael's hard work begins to pay off at the cinema. The film that Michael worked so hard for, beating up actors, killing actors, threatening people, etc., doing various favors for Solomon Richards, was finally going to be released. The name of the film is Meltdown, and it would be a mega premiere. So Michael buys a new tuxedo, Jimmy rents a limousine, and they both head straight to the cinema where the film is going to premiere. When they arrive there, everything seems fine, but they end up encountering an unexpected person, Devin Weston himself. The big problem here is that Devin Weston is really pissed off about the death of his assistant Molly, because he is blaming Michael for her death, even though Michael is not at fault. And so, at the moment Michael arrives at the cinema, what would have been this huge premiere and all, Devin tells Michael and Jimmy that they are there, but asks where Amanda and Tracy are. With this, he clearly implies a threat against Michael. So Michael steals the first car he sees in front of him, which happens to be a supercar in front of the cinema, and heads towards his house as fast as he can. Upon arriving, he sees several Merryweather soldiers inside his house trying to kill Amanda and his daughter Tracy, or at least take them hostage. Michael then embarks on a crazy mission to try to kill all the soldiers without anyone in his family getting hurt. And in the last soldier, Michael almost dies, if it weren't for Jimmy's help, who gathers up some courage, turns off the lights, and manages to take down the guy. Michael's fate wouldn't be the best. After this shocking situation, Michael is appalled by everything that happened, takes his family, and leaves the city. The next day, he returns to Los Santos, calls Lester and tells him that his house has been compromised. People now know Michael's address. They are after Michael's family, and he needed to figure out a way to resolve this.
They came to my house, Lester. My house! So I asked Amanda and the kids to move out for a few days.
I hate to say it, but Merryweather isn't short on excuses to come and kill you, nor is Devin Weston.
I ain't looking for perspective, Lester. They came after my family.
All right. I don't know what to say. Does this change where you stand on the Union Depository?
Hell no. We move on that right away. Before it gets any hotter.
That's smart. Meet me at the strip joint. I'll get word to Frank and Trevor.
So now they had to urgently carry out the Union Depository heist so that they can raise money, become much richer, and then after that, they would take care of Devin Weston. With that in mind, Michael's family is safe outside the city. Michael calls Franklin, Trevor, Lester, and they begin all the preparations to pull off the heist. As I mentioned, this heist could be done in two ways. The first would be with two helicopters stealing $200 million in gold bars after a frenzied shootout, where Michael with another shooter would go through the top of the bank to draw the police's attention because that bank has 24-hour police available, so they would have to attack on two fronts. While Michael is attacking the bank up there, simultaneously underneath the bank, the real robbery would be taking place. Franklin would be with a tunneling machine, opening a hole in the middle of the vault and taking all the gold bars from inside. After removing all of these gold bars, two helicopters would pick up the two cages full of gold, each with 100 million, and flee with these $200 million to put on a train that had already been robbed and had a designated driver already participating in the heist. This heist is very successful. It doesn't work 100% the way they would like it to, because even when they flee by helicopter, there are other Merryweather helicopters behind them, but still Lester with an RPG manages to shoot and destroy these other helicopters in the sky so that they can actually escape without leaving any trace and the gold be put on the train. After that is done, the heist is closed, which results in approximately 40 million for each of the protagonists. However, this money still needs to be laundered so that it can be transferred to them and so on, which would take a few days, right? Melting the gold, selling the gold, laundering the money and so on, and everyone just chilling, very relaxed. However, in the meantime, after this robbery, where everyone is relaxed, Franklin ends up receiving another unexpected visit at his house. But instead of Tanisha, this time it's Devin Weston himself. And what does Devin Weston want in front of his house with several security guards and so on? He wants to talk to Franklin about some things and basically ask for a favor. Actually, it's not really asking, he's more like ordering. He wants Franklin to kill Michael. So at this point in the game, we already had Steve Haynes and Dave Norton wanting Franklin to kill Trevor, and now we have Devin Weston wanting Franklin to kill Michael.
Nah. Oh, yeah. But that's my boy.
Yeah, but that's my boy. He has betrayed everyone he's ever known. He's got you involved with the federal government, and he's messed up several business ventures of mine. He has got to go. And you know what? I'd like to say that this isn't personal, but it is personal.
127 because Trevor and Michael are beefing, so it wouldn't make sense for either of them to try to kill each other, since neither of them would let the other get close. The only one who would have this opening would be Franklin, both to kill Michael and to kill Trevor. The important detail here is that up to this point, Devin Weston comes to talk about this supposed favor. He doesn't even pay the cars he owes to Franklin, those 5 cars he had to steal for him, and still stays at Franklin's house acting tough. He gives Franklin practically 3 options. The first would be to obey Steve Haynes, which would be very stupid. The second would be to obey him because he does what he wants since he's a billionaire. And the third option for Franklin is to try to defend his friends and die trying. When he confronts Franklin about these 3 options and what his choice is, Franklin kicks Devin Weston out of his house and tells him to leave. And at that moment, Franklin is faced with the choice, where I will choose here the canonical ending, which is to risk everything. Franklin calls Lester and says he needs to talk to him urgently. Arriving at Lester's house, Franklin explains the whole situation, how he is being confronted by the FIB team to kill Trevor, and how he is being confronted by Devin Weston to kill Michael. He explains everything and asks for help from Lester, who at first it seems won't be able to help. And then Lester has a brilliant idea, but needs to confirm some fact. He does a little research and finds out that Devin Weston owns 11% of Merryweather. That's why Devin Weston had been able to send soldiers straight to Michael's house to do favors for him, as he also owned the company. And besides that, Lester also finds out that Steve Haynes was neck deep in all that mess that was going on with him, with people finding out that he was organizing robberies and so on. So Lester's idea boils down to telling Devin Weston and Steve Haynes where the stolen gold, the 200 million, was being melted down in a nearby foundry, because both Devin Weston and Steve Haynes would send teams there to try to steal this gold. And at that moment, Michael, Trevor, and Franklin would be able to ambush these guys and kill them. And that's exactly what happens at that moment. Since Franklin needs all the help he can get, he calls his friend Lamar so that Lamar can help him, right? Also, regardless of anything, Lamar is also a gangster. So he goes there, picks up Lamar, and arriving at the foundry where the gold is being melted down, Lamar's only role is to inform when the guys arrive, so that Franklin, Trevor, and Michael inside can organize and ambush these teams, which are the teams of the FIB and Merryweather, who went there to supposedly try to get this gold. As soon as Franklin enters the foundry and Lamar is outside, he is faced with the tense situation of Michael with Trevor, pointing guns at each other, very similar to that scene seen back in Ludendorff. The difference is that now they are more powerful weapons. After a slight argument, the atmosphere there becomes very tense and they all decide to cooperate. And when I say cooperate, I'm referring to all of them joining forces to try to kill the corrupt teams that are going to enter the place where the gold is being melted. Well, based on that, they start shooting at the people. They ambush everyone, and after a while, Lamar needs to run away because there are already too many people. They manage to defeat all the soldiers who show up there. However, the main guys weren't there, there, Steve Haynes wasn't there, Devin Weston wasn't there. In other words, it wouldn't be enough just to kill the soldiers because Steve Haynes and Devin Weston would end up sending more people after them. Fun 31. So the three, Michael, Trevor, and Franklin, end up agreeing to call Lester and ask for the location of some key guys in this mess. They ask for the location of Steve Haynes, Wei Cheng, who is the leader of the Chinese triad, Stretch, who was the guy setting Lamar up frequently, and Devin Weston. Lester gets the location of Steve Haynes, Wei Cheng, and Stretch immediately. The only one he doesn't get immediately is Devin Weston's, but he still says he can get it after a little while. With that, Michael immediately moves to try to take down Stretch, since Stretch didn't know him. He wouldn't attract attention entering Ballas's or family's territory. Trevor sets out to kill Steve Haynes, who is shooting a TV show down at the Los Santos Pier. So from a distance, Trevor manages to take a precise shot at him. Meanwhile, Franklin is heading over to the Chinese triad to blow up several vehicles, thus killing the gang leader Wei Cheng. The best chance to defeat the Chinese triad would be with Franklin, because the triad people don't know Franklin, only Michael and Trevor. After they manage to take out these three guys, Lester finally gets the location of the final guy, Devin Weston. He sends this location to Trevor, and Trevor takes it upon himself to go there alone, kidnap Devin Weston, and bring him to Michael and Franklin, and that's exactly what he does. When he arrives at the mansion, he is faced with several security guards whom he can easily deal with. After that, he beats up Devin Weston, throws him in the trunk of a car, and takes him to a pier in the interior of the state. Arriving at this pier, he waits for Franklin and Michael to arrive so that they could all settle their differences with Devin Weston. After they all say what they want, they join forces and throw the car off the cliff, thus killing the last guy who was tormenting their lives, Devin Weston. With that done, now Dave Norton, who was under a lot of pressure from his boss, Steve Haynes, ends up moving up in position and taking on Steve Haynes' role, who has now died, leaving all the information about Trevor, Michael, and Franklin quietly tucked away. Lamar can now stay on the streets without fear of being ambushed by the Ballas or falling for another shady deal that Stretch could set up for him. And Trevor can rest easy knowing that the Chinese are no longer after him, as they were in a very dangerous situation. A few days after carrying out this series of assassinations, the payment for the final heist finally hits their accounts, which is around 40 million for each of them. They remain as friends, but now in a way retired. There is a brief continuation that also happens in GTA Online, but in this continuation, at least up to the date I am recording this video, it only refers to Trevor and Franklin. There is no continuation for Michael, and we don't exactly know how his life was. However, according to some dialogues from Franklin, when he is older, it implies that Michael really pursued his career in the film industry and is very successful. In a very concise way, that was the complete story of GTA 5. There are many things here that I couldn't delve into because otherwise the video would be much longer than it already is, and believe me, it's already ridiculously long. I'm sure that if you've watched this video so far, you enjoyed and understood the whole story of GTA 5 in a very comprehensive way, and now I ask for your like, your subscription, and if you want to support larger productions like this, become a channel member. The revenue generated from members and donations helps fund more complex and well-edited videos for you. Having said that, until the next video, take care and see you soon.